it's Ash from Super Videos, back for another video. This is my review of The Last of Us Part 2. Before we jump into it, if you are interested to watch my gameplay with commentary of the game, like the full walkthrough, you can click the playlist that will drop on the top right to go check that out. If you want to watch a reaction highlight reel of the entire game instead, which is only about an hour long, and you don't want to watch the entire 20 plus hours of the gameplay, you can also go check it out on that same playlist. Last thing before we jump into the review, this is a spoilery review, so spoiler warning for those of you who have not played the game but plan on playing at some point. If that is the case, I do not recommend that you watch this review. If people want me to do a non-spoiler review, let me know in the comment section below. If there are enough requests, I'm probably going to make a non-spoiler review at some point. So with that said, let's dive right in. So before I go in detail about whether I loved the game, didn't mind it, enjoyed it as much as the original and whatnot, or I flat out hated it, let me just give everyone a brief summary of my thoughts on the game. I absolutely enjoyed the game. It had its high points, but also it had its low points. It was a journey. It was a freaking roller coaster ride from start to finish. And I think just looking at the entire story from the start of the first game to the end of the second game, it can only be described as a brilliant masterpiece. I think I said it in a tweet that it was a beautiful yet disappointing masterpiece. The story was crafted to damn near perfection, and it's one of the best storylines and general plots I've ever experienced in anything. Literature, movie, TV show, game, comic, you name it. Now the reason it was disappointing was because it was a sequel. As a sequel, it was good when it could have been great. I still loved the first game more than the second. I've thought a lot about why this is, and I think I finally came up with a proper answer. The first game made me fall in love with this universe and these characters, but the second made me understand why I was never supposed to, if that makes any sense. I think what the sequel did was make you question everything you loved about Joel and Ellie. Now that's not what made the sequel not as great. It was the fact that the first made you fall in love from ground up, while the second piggybacked on a lot of the build-up and success of the first game to be as effective as it was. And I get it, that's why it's a sequel, but I just felt that they could have offered something more original that stood on its own, story-wise. Now what they did with the Seraphites was meant to be that gap, but I thought it wasn't enough. And also, the way it was carried out, like the revenge story, was not the most original. It was somewhat expected. It was freaking genius the way it was carried out, but the revenge storyline on its own was not as original as you would want in a sequel game like this. So as a standalone game, I give The Last of Us 2 a 3.5 out of 5 score. It was a pretty solid and entertaining standalone game that I would have enjoyed a lot if I ignore its connections to the first game. Now, like I mentioned before, as a sequel, it could have been better. So I give it a 2.5 out of 5 score as a sequel. The visual and graphics were out of this world. Obviously a lot better than the first, which makes sense. And I'm just gonna add this on to the graphics discussion. The environment and the atmosphere was extremely well done, and you felt immersed into that universe, into that environment, which made the game a lot better and made you feel like you were a part of it more than the first game did, because of the attention to details when it comes to the atmosphere and the environment. So a 5 out of 5 score there. The overall storyline from the beginning of the first game to the end of the second game was breathtaking, expertlessly crafted, and arguably one of the best plots ever. 4.5 out of 5 score there. And it would have been like a 5 out of 5 if they took out some of the unnecessary sections of Abby's parts in the second game, like some of the aquarium bits and some of the stadium stuff. A small thing, but I feel some of that could have been taken out to add other things to the plot, which I'll talk about later on. Now, if we look at the overall storyline for the second game only, that score would be a little bit lower only because it relied too heavily on the build-up from the first game. So little original story was added in to the second game to make it stand on its own, aside from the main revenge concept, which was extremely well done but was not the most original, like I said. Like, I absolutely loved that we got to see both perspectives, and they slowly made us understand how both sides are right on their own, and making you feel like you just want them to put everything behind them and just be at peace. Like, you saw that Ellie has the right to kill Abby as much as Abby has the right to kill Ellie. Really enjoyed that. And the funny thing is that none of them could actually go through with it at the end, like kill the other, which shows that they were both good deep inside. Now, even though I think the storyline for the second game has a little bit of a lower rating than if we look at the entire storyline together, but I decided to just have the rating based on both storylines because it's a sequel. As far as character development goes, characters were fleshed out much better than the first, and there was a lot more characters to flesh out in the second game to begin with. So they kind of had that to their advantage as well. Joel, not as much, but a bit with Ellie and Tommy, and a lot with the new characters like Dina, Jesse, Abby, her father, Owen, Mel, Manny, Lev, Yara, and even Isaac to an extent. Some of these characters you hated at first, but ended up liking them, like Owen, Manny, and Mel, and some were just such complex and interesting characters that you couldn't help but get attached to them, like Abby and Lev. So on the character development front, I give it a 5 out of 5 score. Now, I know I've talked about the flaws a bit already, but here's a brief summary of the flaws I saw with the game. First, its originality. Like I mentioned, the revenge concept was not the most original, but the way it was executed was intriguing. One of the biggest flaws though I had with the game was Joel's death placement. Joel died way too early, and as a result, we never had the chance to have a proper playtime as Joel. And we got a limited time between Joel and Ellie, which I was actually looking forward to. The only interaction between them was in the flashbacks, most of which were not even fight sequences. Like, the one thing that I was actually excited about was seeing Ellie and Joel working together to defeat the enemy, now that Ellie is much older and much tougher. But we obviously didn't get anything like that. The other flaw about the Joel death was actually the way it was executed. So not only the fact that he died way too early, but also it felt like his death was a little forced. And what I mean by that is the way it was set up was not the most realistic. Both Joel and Tommy knew of the WLF, and they knew about the dangers. So I just don't understand why in that moment they let their guards down and kind of gave away who they were to this group who they just met, which consequently led to Abby and the others realizing who they were, leading to them being confronted and to Abby killing Joel. So I thought that if anything, Tommy, who was a former Firefly, would know that former Firefly's members joined the WLF and that they were definitely out for blood to get not only Joel but maybe even Tommy as well. So that aspect of it was a little unrealistic and took you out of the moment just a tiny bit. Now, the other thing I want to say about Joel's death is that it didn't need to happen. I mean, Joel's death was inevitable and he was gonna die sooner or later, but I just feel like they could have had it so that Dina is the one that dies. That leads Ellie to want to go and seek revenge. They could have had it so that Joel was just injured extremely bad, maybe paralyzed or something like that. But I just thought that killing Joel as a catalyst to build this revenge story was a little bit of a waste. And they could have done it if they replaced Joel with Dina, which they actually made it out to be in the trailer. Two other flaws were there were too many instances of you're walking and the floor gives way and you fall. That was overused a bit too much. And also I felt like every time something major happened or some major event went down, you either opened the door or went through an opening. So that was overused a bit too much as well. Going back to what I said earlier about the entire story versus the story in the first and the second game, I felt like the way they split the story could have been better. Like instead of ending the first game where they ended it, they could have brought in some of the elements from the second game that were flashbacks. So the story is a lot more smooth and linear in the second game. For example, this stuff with Tommy and Joel at the beginning of the game, and a lot of the flashbacks between Joel and Ellie could have been included in that first game. Now I know that was one of the main components of the structure of the game, like the non-linear sort of storytelling, but I thought it could have been improved. This actually gets me to my next point. The way the story was structured works a lot better for like a movie or even better on a TV show than a game. That may be an unpopular opinion, but anyway, I just think that there was too much back and forth in the timeline. A more linear timeline would have been better in terms of making you stay on the journey rather than lose yourself and try to reconnect with the story. That took me out of the moment a little bit. Maybe it was just me, but I felt like I had to keep switching my brain back and forth. In terms of the ending, the only negative thing I have to say about the ending is that it was somewhat expected. Extremely well done, deep and emotional, but not original. I think I even said during my gameplay, if the ending is any of the following three, it's not original. One is that Ellie kills Abby or the other way around. Two is that Ellie lets Abby go. And three is they get separated again. Now, what could have been another way to end this story, you may ask? I don't have the answer for you. I just think that they could have added in something slightly different. Now let's switch gears and talk about all the reasons I loved the game. All the positives, since we were just talking about it. Aside from the fact that Ellie pretty much saved Abby and Lev, which I absolutely loved and thought was powerful, I absolutely loved Joel and Ellie's conversation and the way that those two reflected off of one another. In Joel's final scene with Ellie, Joel says if he was given a second chance, he would do the same thing and make the same decision and save Ellie instead of letting them find the cure or find the vaccine or attempt to find the vaccine. That reflects back on what Ellie did and begs the question, what would Ellie have done? So Ellie went back to find Abby with full intentions of killing her. Yet, she not only let them go, but essentially saved both Lev and Abby, who would have died if it wasn't for her. So if someone asks Ellie whether she would have done it all over again if given a second chance, I wonder what she would say. Because not going after them would have essentially been the same as letting them die. And she would still have Dina. Other positives, I talked about this one already, but experiencing two sides of the story was great. Although some of Abby's portions felt flat, sort of dull, and boring. Having the third villains in the mix, the Seraphites or the Scars, was awesome. They were like the common enemy that both Ellie and Abby were fighting against, which I thought was pretty interesting and very, very entertaining. Also, having the Rattlers in at the end made it more interesting. It would have been kind of interesting though to have the story go down like Ellie and Abby have to kill the Rattler gang to get away from them, but they didn't go that route. Maybe for time, since the game was already running long, but it would have essentially been a former WLF member, Abby, a former Seraphite member, Lev, and Ellie, who were all once enemies, working together to defeat a common enemy. So I thought that could have been powerful if they went that route. The other thing I liked, because of how they did it, because it was shocking, maybe the most shocking death for me was Jesse's death. They made us think that it was actually going to be Dina, that dies until Jesse died. They did this not only in the game, but in the trailer as well. Like, they wanted you to think that Dina dies. So that was very, very interesting and unexpected. Speaking of Dina, I thought it was a pretty interesting callback when Abby was about to kill Dina and Ellie said she's pregnant and Abby just said good and was about to kill her anyway. It was sort of like good, because now you know how I feel about Mel, who you killed, who was also pregnant. So I thought that connection was also very interesting. Last thing I want to mention is some of the new mechanisms added into the game in terms of the actual gameplay were extremely well done, like filling your health laying backwards, or shooting laying backwards, or going through crawl spaces, walking in snow, or walking in water, because you could literally feel the force working against you, so you had to hold the buttons more to actually get anywhere. So I thought those were cool. The cutscenes being integrated with player actions was also a nice touch, and the workbench was a good new addition. And I loved that workbenches in the island were different than the other ones, because Seraphites built them. So I thought that was pretty cool as well. Now, in terms of the highlights of the game, things that I absolutely loved or things that were memorable, one being Joel's beating, of course. Although, like I said, the placement was not ideal and it could have been executed better. I just thought that it was one of the most memorable scenes in the entire game. Also, Joel telling Ellie the truth about what actually happened and the fact that he lied to her was also very interesting and very powerful as well. The reveal about Abby's father was a pretty big and major moment. Owen and Mel's death was extremely deep and dark and very interesting. And I love the fact that we actually saw it from two perspectives. So that was also very cool and made it more impactful. Yara and Isaac's death, which happened back to back, those two deaths were also very interesting and kind of unexpected. Abby confronting Ellie was, of course, one of the highlights of the game. The end, of course, when they met up again, that confrontation was also cool. But also seeing Ellie forgive Abby, although it was expected, like I said, it was extremely interesting and powerful. And of course, the Ellie and Joel conversation at the very end was super, super deep and super interesting. Going through all of these big moments, I just realized that many people died in this game, and it felt like people were dying left and right. My favorite characters in order were Ellie, of course, and Joel, but he wasn't in the game much, Abby, Owen, Dina, and Jesse. Another thing I want to talk about, since we cover a lot of Walking Dead on this channel, is interesting connections between The Last of Us 2 and The Walking Dead. The first, which jumps at you, is the whole thing about nothing is black and white. Who you start the story with dictates who you root for. That was the conversation when it came to Rick versus Negan on The Walking Dead. And it's the same kind of thing with Ellie and Abby. Like, if we started the game with Owen and Abby instead of Joel and Ellie, would we still have thought that Ellie and Joel's actions were justified? You know what I mean? So I thought that was pretty awesome. The other thing I thought was interesting was that they chose to have Joel be beat to death with a golf club. Since in The Walking Dead, Negan beat Glenn to death with a baseball bat. Not saying they copied, but obviously it made it less original. Who knows, maybe it was their way of getting even for copying Joel's injury from the first game, falling into the rebar by having Rick get the exact same injury. Also, I thought it was kind of funny that Dina was raising JJ, her and Jesse's son, who he never got to meet, which was identical to The Walking Dead, how Maggie had to raise Glenn Jr., who Glenn never got to meet. So they both had that in common as well. In terms of the overall score, I would give the game a 4 out of 5. If you're wondering how I got that, I just added all the ratings that I talked about at the beginning and did an average. Compared to the first game, for those of you who are interested, the first would be like a 4.5 out of 5 or even maybe a 5 out of 5 for me. But with all of that said, that was my review of The Last of Us Part 2. I hope you all enjoyed the game and I hope you enjoyed my review. If you liked the video, make sure to press the like button. If you are not a subscriber, subscribe to join our community and press the bell to be notified about uploads. That's it for this video. See you next time for another super video.